Hello and welcome to this very special edition of the Association for Coaching podcast. My name's Darren Robson and I've been one of your hosts of the podcast series over the course of the last year. And on this occasion, I'm very proud to be joined by four of my peers. So if you'd all like to go around and introduce yourself and let the listeners know which series element that you were looking after, that would be wonderful. So whoever wants to go first, this is going to be fun for us today.
My name's Rob Lawrence and I hosted the Boost Your Coaching business earlier this year, around about the April time. That series kicked off and it was a really enjoyable and insightful series for me to host. It certainly taught me a lot more about the business side of coaching and how to grow that side of things. And it also introduced me to a wonderful eclectic mix of people that are doing some pretty pioneering and innovative stuff in the coaching space. That was me and my series.
And I can jump in next because as Rob was saying, I learnt so much. I also learnt so much from my series. So I'm Alex Morgan and I hosted the series around diversity and inclusion in coaching. Learnt loads on that series from some hugely interesting people, about oppression at work, about the democratization of coaching, about measuring and embedding inclusivity, about privilege, about belonging, loads of amazing themes and really interesting stuff.
And I'm Sue Stockdale, and I was hosting the Coaching in the Workplace series, which kicked off the Association for Coaching channel. So episodes 1 to 16 or something like that, you would find the ones that I recorded with a fascinating group of leaders from many different types of businesses around the world.
And I am George Warren, and I was the host for Coaching in the Climate Crisis, a series where I spoke to some fascinating coaches and psychologists and thought leaders, really with the questions of how can coaches coach around this subject of the climate crisis? Is it our place to talk about it? And, what does the coaching industry as a whole, what's needed of it by way of maturity? And theme of a lot of the podcasts I've enjoyed across these series have been where coaching as an industry needs to mature and needs to grow, and where society needs coaching to spread its roots away from traditional subjects of coaching.
Well, thank you all. It's really interesting, as Sue shared, she was really the sort of pioneer for us with the podcast series, along with Rob, who sort of joined the team and said, have you considered giving podcasts a shot as the Association for Coaching? And it's been a real investment from the organisation and a labour of love from the team. And I'll get into the team sort of towards the end to thank them because they've done such a fabulous job. And, what was so wonderful when we set off on this journey, what we wanted to do was amplify the AC community's voice, engaging meaningful, rich and diverse conversations, and then hopefully provide actionable insights. And as I was reflecting today, and I've got a page in front of me here, as I'm sure my peers have got, is just the eclectic mix of both people that we've interviewed, but also the subject areas is just something that I'm, on a personal and professional level, as somebody who's part of the Association for Coaching, but also just as somebody who loves the profession, I'm so proud of the work that has been co-created by everyone that's on this call and all the teams and the guests that we've been very fortunate to interview. And the subjects just are such a wonderful array and an eclectic mix. And, later on, we'll get into the future of coaching and potentially the future of this podcast. And I'm personally really excited to see where 2022 and 2023 goes for us, because if this last year or so is anything to go by, I think it's going to be really wonderful. So turning to the subject of some of the personal insights, who'd like to share some of their personal and professional reflections from their series?
There's so much I don't actually even know where to start, to be honest. I suppose the general theme from a lot of our speakers was a real challenge to the coaching industry, and a serious challenge, a challenge not to be taken lightly and that we all need to pay attention to. And that challenge was that, coaching is an industry, and there are coaching organisations within that industry, and that industry and those organisations suffer from institutional racism, from inequities, from oppressive practices, from not paying attention to privilege, from not paying attention to difference. And we as coaches and the coaching profession need to really look in the mirror and pay these things attention, because unless we do, our coaching profession, George mentioned coaching maturity earlier, we're not going to mature as a profession. And I think this is, sorry to start on a serious note, but this is really serious, and we all have to pay this attention.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, Alex. And I think when we go around and gather the reflections from the wider team, I just wanted to give some context to it, because I've just been doing a sort of a global listening tour on behalf of the Association for Coaching, and I was looking for mega trends. So what were some of the big contextual trends that people are seeing? And it's interesting because we're going to pick up on some of them. So climate obviously came out, global leadership came out. What you're talking to is inequality in all its guises came out. Next generation, young people, mental health, and then AI, tech and digital disruption. So it's going to be interesting, I think, this conversation, because as I was reflecting on the various different series, it seems like we've naturally started to pick up on some of those trends. And I think what you're talking to is a really important area of deeper conversation and deeper collaborative conversation, both on an individual basis, a collective basis, a community basis, but also as professional bodies and the organisations that are part of this. I think it's a huge area, and I think there's a number of huge areas that we're going to be picking up. So I wanted to reinforce that the recent piece of work that I've done on behalf of the AC suggests absolutely that this is a trend, and this is something that's really serious and important for us to explore.
And just to pick up on a couple of your points, I mean, firstly, I'm really looking forward to seeing the results of those conversations, because I'd be fascinated to hear the detail there. But secondly, you were talking about collaborative conversations, and that is another theme that came out. I'm recalling Stacey Graham on my series, and she has collaborative and also sometimes difficult and challenging conversations to face up to the issue of racism in the workplace. And so she tackles that with the tool, if you like, of conversation. And I think this is where us as coaches, we can help with helping people with skillful conversations and equip people with the tools to have those conversations.
Absolutely. And we'll pick up more on that in a little while. Who else wants to share some of their personal reflections from their series?
Well, I want to go from your megatrends, Darren, at the big picture level, to almost the opposite end of the spectrum. And for me, one of the key reflections I took away is just the simple power of a conversation between two human beings. And that the podcasts, when I've listened back to the whole series, not just the ones that I've recorded, I think it's a really brilliant learning tool for anybody that's wanting to learn to have effective conversations. Picking up on Alex's point, how is a question constructed? What is said and what's not said? The intonation of the interviewer's voice and the guest's voice, for that matter. And I've loved challenging myself to construct an environment that brings out the brilliance of a guest and challenges them at the same time, to maybe ask some of those difficult questions that they haven't been asked before, so that not only do they inform the listener, they learn something about themselves. So we're really expanding the learning environment for everybody. If we can be using this podcast channel as a means to help people to learn to have more effective conversations by just how they listen to the podcasts as much as anything else, with a different ear. What's the mindset of the guest as they're answering these questions? What is it they're not saying? There's a curiosity there that I hope will encourage people to listen to even more of the episodes.
Beautiful. That's wonderful.
Well, to pick up on something that Alex mentioned as well, one of the one of the assumptions I was holding about having 11 conversations about the climate crisis was that it would be characterized by hard work and very strong, powerful, negative feelings, hopelessness, overwhelm, eco-anxiety, which we're hearing more and more and more about every time you pick up a newspaper. And I totally agree with Alex's point that both topics of inclusion and the climate crisis are big, heavy, scary, important, necessary topics for humans, whether we're a coach or not, to be speaking about. One of the nice surprises for me was how much joy and fun and hope and playfulness can take place within a conversation around these subjects as well. And I laughed and smiled a lot more than I thought I would be during these conversations. And I sort of transformed, even in myself, from a position of overwhelm and what can I do? I'm just one person. Through having these conversations myself, I ended up towards the end as someone even more engaged and really anchored in a sense of hope. And a real turning point for me was the conversation with Chris Johnston, who with Joanna Macy wrote the book Active Hope, which just helped totally change. Coaches are in the mindset change game. It totally changed my mindset, how I approach and how I actually take my own coaching forward. And having these conversations has I think, like the point earlier, has made me an even better coach. And I've enjoyed and I've found much more humor in these conversations, much more fun and much more optimism as a result of having these conversations too, and listening back to them as a listener.
Thanks, George.
I think there's so much in all of what everybody said there that I can relate to. And it's really interesting too, for me, Darren, to hear some of the findings that you have found already, or some of the main mega themes, if you like, that are starting to crop up now, because they happen to reflect my experience from this year, not only as a host, but having the privilege of listening to these conversations in very great detail at the same time from the production side of things. And the things that are really sticking out for me from this year, and with all that's been said so far today, it's definitely a time for us as coaches to be stepping up our own leadership, our own personal leadership, and inspiring leadership in others. And it's really interesting to me that is a trend that you've picked up on too, because I reflect back to Sue's conversation with Renee. In fact, she had two. And off the back of those, one of the things that has really stood out for me and has stuck with me is the courage to take some kind of action, whatever that action may be, based on what we've learned. It's one thing to learn something. It's one thing to listen to these conversations, but it's another thing to actually integrate what it is that we've learned once we've heard those conversations, and then actually make a difference or have a go at something. And I remember Renee saying that be bold, and you might fail. But if you don't take action, if you're not bold and you don't take action, then you definitely will fail. I've felt very uplifted to George's point there, and I feel a great deal of optimism. I feel a great sense of connection listening to these conversations to other coaches, even though I've most likely not ever met them in real life as such. But I feel close to them and I feel connected to them through these conversations. But I also feel inspired by them. And it's amazing how somebody you didn't know 30 minutes later could inspire you to make a small but significant change in your life, coaching practice, or the next conversation you have with somebody. I often find myself sharing what I've just learned from the previous listening experience with somebody that afternoon and referencing it. So I think there's so much to take from these conversations from 2021, and there's some pretty prickly, serious issues to be dealt with in the world today. But there's every reason to have a sense of hope and optimism. And I think that we don't have to take ourselves seriously, even when we take our work seriously. That's one of the things that I've definitely got a sense of this year. There's something to be said about tackling some of these bigger pieces with a sense of lightness and with a sense of joy and optimism. So that's definitely something that's going to be that I'll be carrying forward from all that I've experienced through the podcasts this year.
Yeah, thank you all. I think it's really interesting for me. I mean, obviously, I did the health and wellbeing series. I was at the gym today, so so it's quite interesting. But it's been interesting to note how after I did the podcast on a personal level, I really enacted those daily habits and those simple daily habits. I really did, and I was really on it in the summer. And then post-summer, the autumn started to kick in. I know we're still in autumn technically, but I started to drop away from them. And in the last couple of weeks, I'm like, actually, I need to get back into that. Actually, those daily habits that people like Tony Phillips were talking about, mental health that my sister was talking about, and others, it was actually small actions are so important, so vital. And actually, it's been good for me in the last couple of weeks, knowing that we're going to do this, to actually remind myself of some of those insights and learnings, that I took into that practice myself for my own health and well-being. And I think that's so important. I think the piece that a number of you've picked up on around optimism and active hope, I think, is also really important. I think it's really important because we are talking about huge, quite scary subject areas at times. And, one of the things that I'm really looking forward to do next year is actually look at how we get more scientific-based people to come into the podcast series and actually break down some of the technicalities of some of these big challenges in even more detail, and not just individually, but actually maybe in group conversations as well. But that's something we can kind of talk about later on, maybe, because I'd love to kind of hear some of your thoughts and ideas. We've talked about some of the aspects of our own areas of learning, but I think one of the other things that from the AC team perspective that we've realised, and Rob's been so fantastic at being a brilliant mentor to all of us, I think, on this journey. I personally grew a huge amount and learned a lot from Rob, as well as all the other things that he offers out to the AC. But one of the things that the team have acknowledged is actually watching us all grow as hosts, seeing us all grow as hosts. We'll come back to the subject areas of what we've picked up in the subjects, but take it on a personal level. What are some of the things that you're taking away? I know, Alex, you're still right in the midst of it at the moment, still recording and finalising your series. But what are some of the personal things that you've learned and gained from becoming a host of the AC podcast? Because obviously, we'll be looking to get more people to come on that journey and experience that as well. So what are some of your experiences?
Well, I'm not one to generally say that I'm proud of myself, to be honest, although I spend a lot of time encouraging my coachees to be proud of themselves. But, that's often the irony of being a coach, isn't it? But I'm not one generally to say that. But I am really proud of this. I'm really proud of the podcast series that I've hosted, and proud of it and about it for a number of reasons. Partly because we were talking about things that often people brush under the carpet, that they don't want to talk about, or it's too hard, it's in the too hard to do pile. And we've talked about it, and we've talked about it honestly and openly. And so I've learned, and I hope the listeners have taken from this as well, that those conversations are hugely important. Have those conversations. And I've also learned that, if you fluff your lines as such, number one, Rob is in the background and he can sort that out. But, in actual real life, I've learned that actually sometimes you just got to have honest, open human conversations and not worry about fluffing your lines. And it's in that conversation where the relationships are built, where the truth is found, where the heart is found. And that's what I've loved about it.
Thanks, Alex.
Something I was conscious to do was to open up to my own journey and my own ignorance around the subject, and the fact that it's quite easy for us as humans and as coaches to look at a particular coach who's maybe established in their field and say, well, something of a sort of hero worship. And one of the most important conversations I had in this series was with one of my own heroes, Zoe Cohen, and I essentially said as much to her. I think rightly, she just came back and said, well, I'm just one person doing my thing. And that really helped demystify the fact that we can all become heroic figures and leaders and very inspirational people by just doing what we think is right. And something I've encountered a huge amount in the last couple of years is lots of coaches who want to do more around, let's say, climate change, but also diversity and inclusion. and just get stuck in our own heads. But who am I to be doing this? I don't want to get called out as an imposter. I haven't got a degree from Cambridge in sort of environmental science. And I think, something I took from one of those very early conversations with Zoe is, if we weigh up the risk of ourselves of not doing it because we might get laughed at, or might fail, or might get called out, it's a very small risk. If you weigh that up against the risk of you not having conversations about this subject and potentially not inspiring a dozen, 25, 100, 500, thousands of people, if you stack them up, the risks, that the math doesn't really add up. Whether it was intended or not, from Zoe, I took a real sense of just get over yourself and just do it and just have conversations and take that step, because it's really important that you do. And if you don't, it will be a great shame. You might not help loads of people and you'll probably regret it later on. Alex, have I sparked something for you?
Yeah, you have completely. Because I had that. Who do I think I am to do this series about diversity and inclusion? I had it. So I relate entirely to what you've said. My research area was around inclusion, but in a very specific area about linguistic and cultural inclusion in international teams. So even though I have a research area around that, I still didn't think I necessarily had the right to have some of the conversations that I had. And I had butterflies, like, oh my goodness, who am I to be speaking to these people? But I completely agree with you, George, that it was so worth the risk, the personal risk. And, I hope it also proves that even if you don't feel an expert in having these conversations, that it gives people courage to have the conversations.
Maybe I could follow on from what you're saying there, Alex. For me, what I'm hearing is about almost the sense of vulnerability. And that, for me, is one of the core skills, or perhaps mindset, for a coach to have. Is, as a coach, we don't have to have the right answers. We just have to have the questions and the curiosity and interest to step into the other person's world. The thing I learned was about approaching these conversations as a coach, that frame in my mind, not as a podcast host. So that meant not having to have the answers. And if I listened really well to what the guest was saying, then the next question would follow. I didn't need to have a script. Yes, a script can be helpful, or not a script, perhaps some focused questions or areas of interest. And what I found is several of the guests I interviewed, it was their first experience of being a podcast guest. So for me, I wanted to make sure that was a really enjoyable experience. And that setting the context, setting the environment, creating safety started way before they even showed up at the end of a microphone. It was in the communication beforehand, making them feel at ease and having a lightness. We've talked about that kind of humour and lightness, just in a personal communication. And then for some, I sent them some example questions that were on my mind, things I would like to learn from them, and said, this is just what's my thoughts are. We're not going to follow this as a script or a format. It helped them to prepare, to start to maybe think about what was going to be of interest. And then even in the conversation was to just put them at ease right at the start and to say, we're just having a conversation here. And if you say something, as has been mentioned before, that you think wasn't appropriate, then just stop and say it again in a different way, that those things can be edited out. And I did get feedback from several of the guests I interviewed, having had their first experience, was that they felt they were at ease, they really enjoyed the process and they wanted to go on and do more. And that is a really important learning, I think, not only as a host, but as a coach, is back to my kind of creating the environment question. If we're prepared to be vulnerable, if we create an environment where somebody else feels safe enough to be vulnerable, then everyone's going to have a chance to learn there. And that's what we need to do if we're going to make change, if we're going to step out of our comfort zones and learn new things and apply perhaps some of those inspirations that Rob was talking about earlier. That's what I learned.
I love that, Sue. I think the risk that comes with chiming in last, like I'm doing now, is that everybody sort of says the points that you had in mind. So just to build on those and re-emphasize them in my own interpretation, I suppose, is that to your point there, Sue, I think there is something special about, for me, being particularly close to these conversations this year. I'm like, well, on the one hand, I can't now imagine my life having not heard those conversations and how those conversations have changed knowingly and unknowingly the trajectory of my coaching and my life. That there's that in the first space. But in the second, there's something to be said about the importance of what I heard you talking about there, Sue, which is creating the space for these conversations, even though we as the hosts and they as the guests, for many who, this is their first ever podcast conversation, we all feel vulnerable and at risk here, but we're still going to create that time and that space to have what we believe is going to be an important conversation. And it reminds me a bit of what Peter Hawkins was talking about in George's series about being at that learning edge. And I think that's one of the really fascinating things about these recordings is that you can actually hear, I feel we get a sense of that learning edge actually in the conversation. It's being recorded live in the conversation in the room right there and then. And we've got the joy of feeling that transformation, that energy, that motion, that actually happening in the momentness, which is what I think we generally love about recordings of all sort of shapes and sizes. We get to experience that together across time and space, even though we don't have to be in the same place at the same time. So that's one of the things that really stood out for me. Another thing that I think you had touched upon there, Alex, and you too, George, reminded me of the conversation, I think it was that you had, Darren, with, was it Tony Phillips, the 1 mile a day, and how he just started this one small action and the ripple effect that had. It's such a fascinating story, how what I would class as a relatively simple, small concept has built into this much bigger worldwide now community, and people have taken their own ideas, they've internalized that idea and created a version of that for themselves. And again, I feel that these conversations are an opportunity for one person, even though they may be feeling like, who am I to be having this conversation? But that one person or these people, these two people or more in a conversation can make a huge ripple difference outward into the world across time and space. And let's not forget that these recordings are going to be around for many years to come too, which I think is also further inspiring, because as people stumble across them, let's hope in years to come, hopefully they'll be no less inspiring at that stage as they are today and as they are being recorded. So yeah, for me, I think that's where all of this connects and comes together in terms of the experience, Darren, to your question there.
Yeah, and trust you to take the sort of line and angle that I was going to go down, Rob, so to bring a bit of playfulness and fun into it. Yeah, no, I think Alex, you mentioned pride, and I my sense with my own series was that sense of proudness and pride, and I also just really I learned to just go with the flow. Just allow the space. I tried to at first manufacture and structure it, and what are the areas that we're going to talk about. A bit like some of this prep, we were initially putting out some potential structure just to give that sense of pretend safety, when it's not really needed. Actually, in the vulnerability, the immersion and emergence actually is where the juice really flows. And from my perspective, I think we're probably heading to about 40,000 listeners on this podcast series now, which is phenomenal, which is wonderful. But yeah, absolutely. Let's look out 10 years from now. Let's look out 50 years from now. Where will that be? And this body of work will be there. And it's really interesting as I look back through all the different areas that we've all covered. I always see like album covers, and I see the person and their subject, and it's like album covers. And it really is like a body of work to me personally that we've all been co-creators of. And it's such a wonderful gift to the world, and it'll be wonderful to see in 5 years' time, 10 years' time, if it stands the test of time, and also how our own thinking evolves or how our own ideas evolve. I think that's the other beauty from a personal perspective, as well as the wider professional ripples as you're talking about there, Rob, in terms of longer term time and space. But I think that vulnerability is really important, and I think it's really important to say anyone that's listening to this, you know, from what I've heard, everyone's saying, jump in, let us know. If you really would love to be a host, you've got a subject area that you think is really important that you'd like to be part of, we'd love to hear from you. So please do reach out to the team, because one of the things that we want is diversity of hosts as well. You know, that's part of the joy of this. So what else? What else is sort of, I'm going to stop following the script that I've got here. So what else is bubbling up for people? What's a question that any of you've got at the moment, or a sort of subject area that you want to pick up with in this conversation?
I wonder whether we could go back to that topic of coaching maturity that George mentioned earlier, because I think, you know, all of our podcasts have contributed to that in different ways. So I don't know if that would be interesting to the rest of you to pick up on that theme.
That would be lovely. I think I'd love to do that. I'll just give you a sort of a summary of what I've heard from the interviews that I've done. So there's this real sense around how do we support the consciousness and awareness raising in society. So it's, you know, it's very much big picture. Then it drills down into sort of practical and pragmatic details. You know, so that's one of the areas. Another area that really did emerge was around maturation of coaching. And what does it mean to be a coach moving forwards? And one of the very pragmatic, you know, bringing it Sue's point around bringing it down to the nuts and bolts, the kind of pragmatics. One of the things that was really interesting was people talking about their own maturation process of becoming a professional, being the best coach they can be, but to be the best person they can be ultimately. And in that moment, actually, when they're with clients, they want to be able to share, actually, I really care about injustices in the world, or I really care about contribution, or I really care about climate. I want to be able to share my true voice in this experience. And some people felt a level of resistance to that, and because of some of the parables, the rules, the beliefs, the identity that we have as coaches, they feel like they're really challenging some of those, you know, almost like golden rules. And then there's other people that are, you know, been in a coach for a very long time and actually have worked in multiple different ways. And what they were saying was that actually my client wants me to bring my entire self, my entire orbit of knowledge and wisdom into this conversation right here, right now. And I thought that was really fascinating, that there was, you know, as always with these things, there's different people at different places, but it was fascinating to kind of hear that. And it feels to me like that's part of where we are as an organisation and as a profession, at the moment, is what does it mean to be a great coach? And actually, I always remember Sir John Whitmore used to say, and Sue will remember this, used to say, you know, when we stop talking about coaching and coaches, then we've done our job. So that's always in my mind. His voice always comes in my mind when I think about coaching maturity and my own personal sort of journey to mastery and whatever that means for me, in whatever terms. So those are some of the things that people were talking to me about. And just to share with you, when I went on to those conversations, I didn't offer anything. I just asked questions and sat back and captured the notes, moved on to the next question. It was very much an open space approach. So those are some of the thoughts that were emerging for them. But Alex, you've raised it. So what are some of the things that you're thinking about or intuiting?
Well, I think it echoes exactly what you've said. You know, I've recognised a shift in myself, in my own coaching over the last few years, from someone who assumed that as a coach, I totally and only in service of the client's agenda and what the client wants. And I kept myself, as in, you know, as you were mentioning, my own values, my own beliefs, my own sort of reason for getting out of bed in the morning. You know, I kept all of that to myself. And as a consequence, a few years ago, and, you know, I'm happy to be open about this because those of, you know, people that might be listening, some people have probably known me a long time, so they'll know that this journey happened. I actually completely fell out of love with coaching. And I had to step away. And then on re-engagement, you know, my decision was, well, when I re-engage with coaching, I have to be me. And I have to demonstrate my own values, what I believe is right, what I'm interested in. And to your point, I think that's what makes clients engage with you. That's what makes clients want to work with you, because you're a whole real person. And actually, you know, the coaching research backs that up. You know, the relationship between a coach and a coachee is actually fundamental to coaching success. And so if you're in a relationship, you know, in terms of coach and coachee, then they have to know you, don't they? They have to know who you are, and you're not a blank page. You're actually in it with them. The phrase that I've heard recently is fellow human companion. You know, you're alongside, you're in it, you're with them, and you are part of the system. You're part of the dynamic. And number one, you can't avoid it. It's normal. And if you know anything about systems theory, you know that we're all part of a system and we can't avoid not influencing each other in that way. But also it's deeply human. And that's what I find so exciting about this, you know, this more mature attitude, if you like, to coaching and being a coach, is that it's deeply human. And so, you know, in terms of my progression, if you like, that I can pinpoint based on what you were saying, Darren, is that, you know, I used to sort of sit on my hands, metaphorically and actually literally sometimes, you know, when I'd want to say something, but I'd think it was not my place. That's not what coaches do. That's not what we're taught to do. So now I've moved from that to knowing that actually there are some things that I absolutely have the right to say, that I have earned the right to say, either by my previous experience or because of the relationship that I'm in with the coachee.
Well, it's really inspiring to hear your story and your words there, Alex. And my angle is very similar. Well, as a result of these conversations, it helped me articulate my own thoughts around this, which are, and I owe a debt of gratitude to Hetty Einzig, my podcast guest, but one of the things that humans do as we grow from an infant to a toddler to an adolescent to an adult is establish our conscience. And one of the things that makes us human is the fact we've got a conscience, right? As a profession, if we zoom out and step back, coaching, although depending on where you read it, may have its roots in with the Greeks or wherever, but as a profession, it's still really young. It was sort of 80s and 90s where it moved from sports psychology to the business world. And objectively, that's still really, really young. The coaching industry is still forming its conscience. And something I'm incredibly proud of is conversations like these and the Association for Coaching doing this sort of work and speaking to the kind of guests that we have is helping the coaching industry develop its own conscience. It can't be right that a coach helps a client earn more money and that's it. You scratch my back, I get paid. It's very transactional. And I think the coaching industry was guilty of that before my time. What many, many coaches feel is the right thing to do is that coaching should benefit the society and the planet, not just the client in front of them. Blakey and Day were huge influences on me with their challenging coaching approaches that the financial mess that we got into, or the bankers got into in before the financial crisis, coaching had a bit of a guilty role to play in that, because up until then, too many coaches were helping bankers just earn more money at the cost of wider society. So for me, it's about helping evolve and articulate and develop the conscience of the coaching industry. And for me, that's what I talk about, and that's what I think about when I think about the maturation of coaching and coaches.
And I guess what springs to my mind is the same message, just packaged in a different way. I find it really curious that very often what I experience happens is in an organisation, a potential new coaching client gets 3 coaching profiles and they have to choose who they want to have a coaching chemistry call with. And what's on those coaching profiles? Details about that person's background and experience. And then we go into the coaching conversation, and to what Alex is saying, potentially we're asking that person to leave 3/4 of what was in their profile behind. And they only come in and ask questions and listen. And what I always say to a coach is bring all of yourself. So the client's paying for all of your experience, bring it. It's about how you bring it. And therefore I always come back to the what is coaching about? To John Whitmore's principles again, Darren, raising awareness and encouraging responsibility. If by my input as a coach, I'm helping the client to raise awareness and encourage responsibility by sharing an experience from another sector, by asking them a question about how their issue relates to society or mankind. If I'm doing that in service of awareness and responsibility, I think I've done my job. The client's getting great value. Would you buy a computer and then only expect to get 20% benefit from how it worked? No, you'd want to get full value. And I just kind of have that metaphor in my mind to the same point.
something you just said there sums up where I feel this is all going for me, which is challenging or asking that question, what is coaching about? And I think for me, what I've learned this year through the podcast alone is that the answer to that question is changing. And to George's point there about, the consciousness of coaching, I think absolutely this series alone is evidence of that evolution for me. I mean, you can listen to each conversation all the way through and you get a sense of where coaching is going. And it's fascinating to me. And I actually sit here today reflecting on where I was probably about a year ago prior to hearing these conversations. And I actually realise, and probably still am, very blinkered and unaware of where coaching is going and where it's permeating and the effect it's having and how coaching is showing up in people's lives. Because I think that's these conversations has revealed to me an incredibly rich array. And I'm sure there are many, many more ways and places that coaching is showing up that I haven't even considered. But it's not just that, it's the way it's showing up and how it's showing up. And again, I reference your series, Sue, because one of the things that stood out from that early series was actually what we think coaching is about and what it's becoming is changing. This sense of bringing our whole selves to the coaching experience is definitely a fundamental theme. I think that's evident throughout every conversation that I've heard in 2021.
Yeah, so there's a really important series of messages in there about being very real, being yourself, being true to yourself, your authentic self. It's going out there and working with people, helping them to be authentic and honest, and just to sort of share. It's my own personal journey with that. And Alex, some of the things you've shared really resonate with me about. I've fallen out of love with my own coaching experience. At times, not the profession, but my own relationship to it, and how much the potential of it. Because sometimes I've seen behaviours that I just feel are at odds with the philosophy that sits and underpins coaching. So that really sort of resonates with me, and then you have to come back to it and sort of reassess yourself and say, well, actually, how do I, enact that? I'm part of the system. What do I need to do? And I think also, that report that I wrote, it wasn't comfortable to share some uncomfortable truths. So with my peers and with our internal Association for Coaching team as well, that was not always easy to sort of share. It wasn't my voice; it was the collective voice. I think that's the other thing, and I think that's a really important place and a role that as coaches we can play. George, you just mentioned there Greek. Absolutely. Go back to the witness and being a witness. Goes right back to past great writers and thinkers. And our role as a witness is so vital, I think, in the coaching profession. Some of the parables of life. The emperor's new clothes. Actually, you're naked right now. We're naked as human species. Humankind is naked, and I think we have a responsibility, and we have the opportunity to support that conversation. And we're not about being right. It's not about being. It's about saying, let's share our own experience and our own thinking. At times in this past year, I found it very difficult to read some of the literature and research that I was doing, around climate, and listening to some of the conversations, George, that you were party to. Alex, I'm finding some of the conversations you're in at the moment very, very difficult to listen to, and I have to stop, come back to them, rewind it and listen again and go, actually, that's really quite challenging and tough. So I'm really excited personally, go back to that piece about hope. I'm really excited as we look out to the future and the profession and this podcast series and what the AC can do and what the professional bodies can do about how can we engage in a richer collaborative conversation to discuss some of these topics that we five right now are having, in a very honest and candid way, and not about being right, but about saying, this isn't my expression of truth right now in this moment. Now, tomorrow it might be different, but I need to share that right now. And I think that's going to be quite fascinating. How can we use this podcast system to kind of enact some of those conversations? So I think maturity is a really big one. What else? What else is a sort of another area? As you look out to the future and you look out 2022, 2025, 2030, and you imagine the way the direction the world is travelling and humanity and humankind is travelling, and then right down to our profession, how our profession is emerging. And just to give you another trend that was shared in the report was around, people were saying, some people don't like the phrase democratising the coaching. I did a TEDx 8-9 years ago now, and I used that phrase, democratising the coaching. And what I personally meant was, how do we take coaching into spaces that it's not ordinarily found? And I know a whole bunch of us on here offer that and support various different initiatives, which is really exciting. And one of the trends that came out was actually, how do we as a profession support spaces where coaching is not easily available, and take money off the table in lots of ways. Actually, where people in Kenya, Uganda, Africa, Madagascar, how could we take this wonderful art form and science that is the profession of coaching and take it into harder to reach areas? So that's a subject area that I'm personally really passionate about, and we'll look to support the AC with next year, and how can we actually start to put some projects in place to actually support in those areas. But what else? What else is really meaningful to you? As you look out to the future, what would you love to see us do more of? What would you love to what conversations would you love to see and hear?
It's a lovely question, Darren. I'm happy to jump in because A, your question sparked something for me, but also B, I think a lot about that question too. I think COVID and the move to lockdown accelerated the accessibility increase for coaches. One of the things that I see is, which doesn't sit right with me, is that traditionally coaches have been those that have quite experienced in their careers, let's say get to a point in their career where they want to pivot or are able to retrain and sort of almost move sideways. Let's say someone in their sort of 40s or 50s might then retrain as a coach. And what I'm really excited by now are the idea that almost doing away with that, and folks in their teens, in their 20s, learning coaching skills, and coaching being a profession that you can go into from school, from uni, and you don't have to spend 10, 15. I was incredibly lucky to be a sales director in my 20s, got all that experience. So when it came to my 30s, I sort of lost passion for that and retrained as a coach. Was very, very, very fortunate to be able to do that and to fund my own coaching development. I think where coaching ought to go is finding a way so that it can provide coaching skills and a coaching approach and a coaching career to that sort of other, to a much wider and much more diverse population, and I mean on a global scale there, so that the accessibility to high quality coaching training doesn't need to come from those that reach a certain level of their career seniority, etc.
Thank you, George. You've sparked a number of thoughts, and also connected, Darren, to what you were saying prior to that. So one of the podcasts that I did that springs to mind is with the wonderful company Circle. It's spelled CIRCL, and I was interviewing Charlie Stainforth, and they run a fantastic system where they work with big companies like Google and other people. So they train the leaders of the big business in coaching skills, but at the same time they also train young people from a huge variety of different backgrounds, mainly young people that would not have access to coaching or coaching training. They put them together, they train them together, and then the young people then coach the corporate clients and vice versa. And it's just an extraordinary thing. And I think, that kind of relation, sort of circular relationship, which is why I can see they're called Circle, that I think is, should be where coaching is going, that it's I completely agree with George that young people can be in it and be as much part of it as as the rest of us and would have just as much right to be a coach as the rest of us. And then to give those people access so that they can contribute, and to give other people access to them so that they can enjoy the coaching relationship with them. That's just a brilliant idea as far as I'm concerned. And it just sprang to mind because it speaks to a couple of things that Darren and Georgie were saying.
For me, something that's becoming very evident through a lot of these conversations is that how essential coaching is becoming as a life skill for the future. And I think because of that, as coaches, I think we need to promote coaching, and we need to be talking about the business of coaching rather than just coaching. I think that's one of the great things that this podcast series has been giving us the opportunity to do, is raise the awareness of coaching. I was this person once. I never even knew coaching existed. I didn't know what coaching was. I once I did, I recognized it. I've had conversations like this way back when. And I think helping people to understand from their own point of view how coaching can fit into their life and what it can do for them is really important to keep in mind. And I think it would be very easy as coaches in the coaching space to assume that everybody is aware of coaching and they understand the power of coaching and what coaching is. But there's a tremendous, probably a disproportional amount of people on our planet still that have no idea that coaching exists and that coaching is available to them even. And it may not be available to them, but I think that's changing too. So on the one hand, it's I feel it's a life skill of the future. This is something that I'm learning through these conversations. But I think there's another thing too, which is coaching is one of the few, if not the only skill, I could probably be as bold to say it's perhaps the only skill that can leverage all of your other skills. So it's a really fascinating conversation to be having, this one right now, about, what is coaching and where is coaching going and how coaching is evolving and where coaching is evolving and the areas that coaching is evolving into. It's still got a long way to go, but it's starting to really pick up. And I think one of the things that, to George's earlier point there, I think through the pandemic, I think we all, in certain areas of our life, conversations from home, working from home, we all felt a sense of acceleration in certain areas of our life. And I think also during that time, it may be because of that, but I feel that coaching too is accelerating in terms of the number of people that are interested in coaching, but also where coaching is going, the amount of research, the recent research that Charmaine on Alex's series mentioned, is the first of its kind in the coaching space and probably the first of its kind in the world outside of the coaching space. And I think that is symbolic of where things are going and where we're at right now. So it's tremendously exciting, I have to say. I think that's my sort of final thought on that little piece there, is that it's just very exciting where it's going. And the fact that almost anybody with reasonable internet access on the planet can access these conversations, the one we're having right now, and the podcast series, and that may be their first introduction to coaching as they stumble across it, as they happen to be listening to perhaps some music on Spotify, but also searching for other things. And that might be their introduction to coaching. For me, is incredibly inspirational and highly motivational for me.
And maybe if I could just add to what's been said, I really get a sense of the desire from what the other hosts have said already around more people being able to access coaching. And my thoughts go into collaboration and maintaining standards. What I'd love to see is an even greater collaboration between professional bodies. So I would like to challenge perhaps the next season or at some stage in the future to have a conversation with the varying professional bodies as the guests on the podcast, and what is being done to ensure that there is greater collaboration, so that no matter where you get your professional accreditation from, it is recognised reciprocally across different organisations, so that we're not, as a body, as an industry, limiting the potential that the people who have been trained in various different ways can bring to the world. So I think for me, I'd love to see a greater kind of abundance approach and really a leadership of collaboration that I think could help everybody to maintain and enhance the professional standards that we are having around coaching and those organisations working together even more effectively.
Just to build on Sue's point there, another thought came to mind, which is it would be lovely in time to hear different voices from different cultures in different languages talking about coaching. There's a tremendous amount of potential there too. We're very lucky at the moment here in the UK, which tends to be sort of on the leading edge anyway of coaching, but also with English speaking podcasts talking about coaching. But it would be really great to see in the next few years that being matched by other languages, other cultures, other people talking about coaching in their own context. This idea of sort of cross-pollination and collaboration across different bodies, but also different cultures too.
Yeah, and yes, just to add to that, Rob, I couldn't agree more. I mean, that's a subject very close to my heart and connected with my area of research. But one thing to just add on to your really good points is that, coaching is also different in different cultures. So, what we think as coaching can look quite different, but the result of the coaching is the same, in terms of liberating thinking, of enabling others, helping others to grow, helping others to, be on that learning edge. Just because there is a way of doing coaching that, we probably all know very well on this podcast team, it's not the only way to do it.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, it's this last past conversation just shows the wonderful richness and diversity, and it really it really encourages me and sort of inspires around the sorts of conversation and philosophical debates and about similarities and difference that we can encourage and to have going into 2022 and beyond. And I'm personally really looking forward to that. And from an AC perspective, what I will say is that we have the most open approach to professional standards and accepting all training organisations, and we're very proud of that. And that's something that the AC has always been born on, is to be open to all, because we think that's so important, and it is about inclusion and diversity within that, and that's something that we've held on to all the way through. So I just wanted to share that. So we're sort of coming to time, so I just wanted to sort of really bring it back to you all and say final thoughts or comments that you've got that you'd like to share with people that potentially are thinking about becoming a host, audience, listeners, or people that are potentially thinking about becoming a guest. So any final thoughts that you've got? I'd love to hear those before we wrap this up.
One thought that springs to my mind, Darren, is to let anyone who's wanting to be a host or a guest know that the AC will support you. It's a great backup team. It's a fantastic experience. And I would say thank you to you and the team that aren't on this call today. I've really appreciated the support that's been provided, and I'm sure that will continue on into the future. So whoever's going to be hosting or guesting in the future, you're in great hands. Thanks,
Sue.
Yeah, thanks for that, Sue. And as part of that team, I extend my gratitude to the people I work with. They inspire me, and I just have so much fun working with them. They work incredibly hard. They're meticulous in terms of trying to achieve a certain standard, a professional standard, and they really care about this. I don't feel I could do it if that wasn't the case, but that has only strengthened in my time being as part of that team, and it's such a pleasurable experience to do this, and it feels meaningful. And I think one of the themes that's come up for me is purpose throughout this series, just listening to the series. And I think there's a tremendous sense of purpose behind what the AC are doing here with this podcast. And I think with those thoughts in mind, I mean, people who've heard me talk about podcasting before, podcasts are the beginning of a conversation. And I think that's what's so exciting about this. Coaching is for me very much conversation centric. And I think the nice, exciting thing about these podcast conversations is they are the beginning of the conversation. And I think, to answer your question, Darren, my sort of final thoughts at this particular stage is we've covered tremendous ground already in this year. I believe what we're doing with this podcast series is pioneering in the coaching space. I don't see anybody else covering these themes and topics at this depth on a podcast series in the way that the AC is doing. But at the same time, I feel this is just the beginning I mean, we haven't even scratched the surface yet. This is very much the tip of the iceberg here. And that in itself is compelling.
Thanks, Rob.
And yeah, from my side, I was just reflecting on, what was the real essence for me, my personal experience through it all. And I think it just boils down to the fact that I had conversations with people that I wanted to learn from. And I was delighted to have those conversations. I felt privileged to have those conversations. And to sort of echo Sue's point and what everybody else has been saying on this podcast, if you want to give it a go, then just give it a go, and you'll meet some incredible people and you'll learn an enormous amount.
Thanks, Alex.
And I'm going to widen the lens a little bit and speak not only to people that might want to be a host or a guest, but really, well, to every listener here, whether you're a coach or a leader who coaches or someone who's curious about coaching. There's something about figuring out what your stake is and what you believe to be right and what you think is the right thing to do and what your values say and what your morals are telling you to do. And it's quite easy to have that voice in your head saying, oh, just play it safe and carry on doing what you're doing, and to sort of quash that sense of what you're curious about, what you're passionate about, what you think is the right thing to do, what you feel obligated to do. But this whole journey I've been on has taught me that it's incredibly liberating and empowering and energizing to follow your curiosity, follow your passions, and don't let your sort of inner critic get in the classic coaching, right? Don't let your inner critic stop you from connecting with these amazing people, from following your moral compass. So however you want to pivot your career, your coaching, however you want to evolve your coaching model, do it and start the process. And it's incredibly liberating, and it's probably the right thing to be doing as well. So your coaching and your conversations can go in myriad ways. I encourage everyone to think about what they think is the right way to grow and develop and pivot their coaching, and what society, what the other stakeholders also need of them and their coaching.
Thank you, George. It just leaves me to say, on behalf of the Association for Coaching, but also as a really energized listener, I really love listening to these podcasts. I look forward to it landing in my podcast channel. I just want to say a heartfelt thank you to all of you for stepping up and stepping forward and saying, we'd love to do this. Sue, I love the fact that you helped us break complete new ground along with Rob and the team. I really appreciate, that. I had a wonderful experience with the team to kind of start to move it into a system and structure that we could use on a consistent basis. And I made lots of mistakes, and Rob and the team were just fantastic at supporting. And then, to watch Rob, masterfully go forward and be a host himself. And then George, watching you and listening to you as you went on your journey, and Alex, yours, listening to your experience and listening to your reflections today. It's been wonderful to hear. And, just really encourage other people to kind of come on the journey. As Sue shared, there's a team that have really learned a lot of lessons over the last year, 18 months, and we really do seek to set you and everyone that comes onto it up for success. I do want to say a special thanks to the AC team. So there was a team, so there's Rob, Miranda and Wendy were part of the initial team that along with myself, we really helped to kind of craft the system that sits behind this in the background. And there's lots of other people that now play a role and have been really instrumental in supporting that. So I want to say heartfelt thanks to that. I want to say thanks to the AC leadership team as well for committing to this and investing in this, because it was an investment of not just money, but also time and resource. And I think it's paying dividends and showing that. And I can't wait to see the amplification of that. I also want to say thanks to the guests and also to all the audience members that kind of click in and listen to us and not listen to us, but actually listen to the wonderful guests that we get onto it. So I think that's where I wanted to kind of summarise and say it's been wonderful to be part of this. I've really enjoyed it, and thank you all so much, for being part of this exploration and journey that we've been on.
Thanks, Darren.
Thanks, Darren.
Thanks, Darren.
Thank you. Love the conversation. Thank you.
And thanks, everyone.